Welcome to Inside Marketing with MarketSurge, your front row seat to the boldest ideas and smartest strategies in the marketing game. Your host is Reed Hansen, Chief Growth Officer at MarketSurge.
Hello and welcome back to Inside Marketing with MarketSurge. Today I'm joined by an individual you've almost certainly heard if you've ridden the subway, passed through an airport, or listened to a traffic update in the New York metro area. Bernie Wagenblast has spent decades behind the mic and inside the world of transportation communications. From pioneering real-time traffic reporting on radio to shaping how millions of people receive travel and transit information every day. She's the founder of Transportation Communications Newsletter, a trusted industry resource, and one of the most respected voices, literally and figuratively, in the field. Today, we'll dive into her journey, the future of transportation communication, and what it's like to have your voice guide millions. Bernie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Reed. Glad to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, so obviously you have been very well known for your voice, and we'll get to that. But I'd be curious about how you got to the point where your voice featured so prominently, and how you broke into the broadcasting and transportation communication fields.
Well, for me, it goes back to fifth grade. That was when I decided that I wanted to be on the radio one day. There was just something magical about listening to the radio and hearing all these voices come out of my little transistor radio. And radio, you have to understand, when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, for somebody who's younger, they may not appreciate what radio was. It was sort of your companion. It was the internet of the day. It was where you got your sports scores, your news headlines, your weather updates, time checks, all these different things. And I just thought it was so cool that this was something that you could do for a living. So I started practicing reading out loud because I wanted to be a news person. So that was very key to me, that I'd be able to read news, and I would practice reading newspapers out loud. I ended up going to Seton Hall University because they had and have a great radio station there, WSOU. And radio was one of those things that you can't just learn in a classroom. You really have to get the practical experience doing it. And that college radio station provided that for me. It was a great opportunity to learn hands-on and do interviews and all sorts of very interesting things. About a year after I graduated, I was fortunate enough to be hired as one of the original on-air traffic reporters for this new company called Shadow Traffic that had come to New York. And for me, that was kind of an amazing opportunity, because here I was, 23 years old. I was on the radio in the biggest market in the country, New York, and I was on in drive time, which is when most people listen to the radio when they're going to and from work. So it was just a wonderful opportunity, and I'm just so fortunate that all these things fell into place for me.
Absolutely. Well, so you continued in broadcasting and had a lot of interesting stops, and but as we talked about earlier, now you've ended up becoming a very memorable voice on New York City transit. Can you talk about how that came to be, and maybe the story behind it? I find it interesting, the balance between the fame that came out of it and maybe the time you spent recording. So, yeah.
Sure. Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but when I was a traffic reporter, I thought it was just a gig in radio. But it turned out to be my introduction to the world of transportation. And after I left traffic reporting for about 5 years, I ended up working in the public sector. And a good part of that time was with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for an agency called Transcom, which coordinated traffic and transit information among all the different regional agencies in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And one of those agencies, of course, was the MTA, which runs, among other things, the New York City subway system. So many years later, after I had left that organization and was doing other things, I got a call from one of the folks at the MTA, and he said, "We're putting together this new system called countdown clocks, and they're going to be displays on the platforms at the subway stations, and we'd like to use your voice to tell riders how long it's going to be before their train arrives." So It sounded like an interesting opportunity. I said, sure. Went into a studio, actually over a couple of days, and we recorded probably about 1,000 individual recordings, usually just a single word or a short phrase. And then the computer ends up putting that all together. So when people are on the platform, they hear a complete sentence. But when I was in the studio, I was recording things like uptown, downtown, numbers 2, 3, 4, Bronx bound, all sorts of different things like that. And these days, if you happen to be riding on the New York City subway and you're in one of the numbered line stations, you might hear me saying something like, the next downtown 1 train to South Ferry is approaching the station. Please stand away from the platform edge. So that's a little bit of how that all came about.
Fantastic. Well, Bernie, how when you're doing voice work, obviously you cultivated, a strong voice from a young age as you were practicing reading the newspaper, and a big part of working in radio obviously is sounding very clear and having a distinctive sound. But what do you do in terms of what are you consciously thinking about as you're doing voice work? Are you trying to convey a mood, or I actually don't know what goes into that thought process.
Well, for me, whenever I'm doing, whether it was a traffic report or recording things for the subways and other things that I've recorded, for the most part, I've always tried to have a smile in my voice. And that may sound a little strange, but it's something that you can pick up. You may not even be able to put your finger on it. But to me, a lot of what I was doing, whether it was a traffic report and people are aggravated about being stuck in traffic, they're running late for work or getting the kids to school or whatever it might be. And the same thing when I'm talking in the subways. People, not necessarily New Yorkers, although they may also be running late, but I'm also thinking of visitors from out of town. And the New York City subway system can be very complicated if you've never ridden it before. Even if you have ridden it before, it can be fairly complicated if you're taking a new route. And I wanted to have that come across, that this was a friendly voice that was guiding them in whatever form it might be. So that's what I always try to keep in mind. How can I make that voice sound just a little more friendly to the person who's listening?
Have you ever had anybody recognize you by voice in public?
Not by voice alone.
Okay.
I had some instances, though, in the past couple of years where my photo or videos of me were out and about, and people would recognize me because of that. So I might be standing on a subway platform or in a train, and someone would say, "Excuse me, are you the voice of the subway?" And I would say yes, and they would often want to take a selfie with me or something like that. So that was kind of cool when that happens.
Yeah, very much. Now, beyond your voice work, you have done a lot of work in transportation, and you've embarked on a newsletter and podcasts. What inspired you to be so broad, and tell me a little bit about those journeys. How did those start, and how are they going?
For me, I remember when I was in college studying about the days of radio and television first getting started. In the case of radio, the 1920s and 30s. For television, the 1950s. Sort of a golden age for both of those. And I thought, wow, it really would have been very interesting to have been involved in the ground floor of these new media and to have been involved with it. But I figured there's not going to be any new media created in my lifetime. Well, surprise, surprise, the 1990s come along, and suddenly there's this thing called the internet that is now gaining popularity among the public. Back in the day, it was AOL and dial-up and things like that. And I just thought, here's an opportunity for me to be involved with a new medium on the ground floor and to sort of just put my own little stamp on it. So it began in probably 1996. I started with one of the organizations I was working for, Transcom. of doing a weekly update about construction that was taking place that weekend and transit reroutes and things of that sort. So that was the beginning. In 1998, I started my transportation communications newsletter. I always like to say that my newsletter has been around longer than Google. So I created that just a few months before Google had its launch. Google was a little more successful than my
It
newsletter.
was close. It was close.
Yeah. But that was this opportunity to, like I say, be on the ground floor of a new medium and do something. Flash forward to 2014, and podcasting was picking up in popularity. In the beginning days of podcasting, you almost had to be a programmer to know how to do a podcast and to get it out there. But it was becoming more user friendly. So in 2014, I started two different podcasts. One I called Transportation Radio, and the other I called Cranford Radio. Cranford Radio was sort of just a public service for my hometown of Cranford, New Jersey. Transportation Radio, though, was building on the experience and expertise I had in the transportation world, where I would do interviews with a variety of people. And from that, people heard the podcast and then hired me to do podcasts on their behalf about transportation. So today, I do two monthly podcasts, one for AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, and the other is for ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers.
Very interesting. And if you don't mind, how do you find content for all the media that you generate? Obviously, you're a reporter, but I know that. I mean, it takes a lot of content to keep things going, and might not be a one-person job. Tell me about how you get enough content to put out so much content.
Sure. Well, for the newsletters, I would consider myself a journalist, but maybe a better, more exact description would be an editor or an aggregator. What I'm doing is I'm searching out content, and I'm really creating links to stories that I think each one of the different newsletters that I do, that audience would find of interest. So I do about 6 different transportation-related newsletters, and each has a somewhat different audience. So I will go through several times a day, searching out news stories and going to sites that I know have a fair amount of transportation content. Mm-hmm. And when I find a story, I will plug it in to the appropriate newsletter. So that's what I do there. For the podcasts, it's somewhat different. For my Cranford Radio podcast, it's basically me. I call it Cranford's version of NPR's All Things Considered. It could be an interview with just about anyone having some connection with Cranford. For the transportation podcasts, the clients are the ones that pick the topics and the guests. So they will tell me who's going to be on. They will come up with some questions for the podcast, but then it's my job to actually ask the questions, produce the podcast, and then return a finished podcast back to the client.
So, I think that's really useful. A lot of in my audience are small and medium-sized business owners, various types, but a big part of being an entrepreneur is branding yourself as a business leader or a thought leader in your space in order to be the person they select. And I think you are a great example of someone who has really has a really strong brand associated with their name, and so you've done a great job at that. So just to pivot slightly, I would be interested to hear more. So you publicly have shared your gender transition and that journey later in your career at a time when your voice and name were already widely recognized. So how did you approach reintroducing yourself to the world, and how did that affect maybe your personal branding and those considerations?
Well, the first part was I reached out to my clients before I transitioned and told them that this was happening. I wanted them to hear it from me and not read about it on social media or in a newspaper or on a site. So that was the first part. And I wasn't really sure what kind of a reaction I was going to get. It wasn't asking permission, but it was informing them and being available to answer any questions. And for the most part, their response was, okay, that's great. That was it.
Awesome. Yeah.
They were very supportive. All of my major clients were very supportive with what I had told them was coming up. For the podcasts, it was a little bit different. When I first transitioned, which was January of 2023, I continued to use what I call my guy voice on the podcasts. But for one of my clients, I went to one of their meetings and they wanted me to do some in-person interviews. And I realized, actually, it took me till that morning of the interview to realize this because I wasn't thinking in this way, that it wasn't really going to work for me to use the guy voice and have this appearance on camera. So I talked to the chief person at my client and said, I'm going to switch to a different voice. Is that okay with you? And she said, sure, no problem at all. So with that, I transitioned my voice on both podcasts to this more feminine version of my voice, which I should note is a work in progress. It is something that's pretty difficult to do for a person who was assigned male at birth and who has gone through a male puberty to develop a more feminine sounding voice, because once your voice gets deep, trying to make it sound more feminine takes a lot of different things that you have to do and use muscles that you may not have ever been aware of. And it's been a process. So if I listen to a recording of myself from a year ago, it's going to sound different than the voice you're hearing right now. And hopefully a year from now, it might sound even better. So it's very much a process of using that. But again, everyone has been very supportive. Now for the MTA with the subways, and I also do the voice on the air train at Newark Airport, the monorail that connects the terminals and the rail station, and also Petco, which is a transit system which runs between Philadelphia and South Jersey. Because all of the earlier recordings were with that guy voice, I still will use that guy voice when they need new recordings because it wouldn't sound very good to have a mix of voice. So I do something that's unusual for most trans people who have transitioned, and that is wanting to have access to both voices. So I will use my guy voice when I need it, and when it's no longer needed, I revert back to this voice.
That's interesting. You're very brave and I think laudable to be so public with this. I'm sure this is a deeply personal process, and thanks for being open with us. I think it's educational, and as I think about, like you say, going through male puberty and making that change even later in life, that must take some real diligence and effort.
It is. It's not at all easy to do, and I had to experiment quite a bit to try to figure out how to do that, and especially how to do it on the fly so I can switch between different voices when I have to. But it's something, when I posted my coming out letter on social media right before I transitioned, and I had a very definite start date. I said January 1st, 2023 was going to be the date that I would start living my life as a woman. And one of the things I said in that coming out note was, I hope that I can be an educator because of my communications background and my notoriety, that might be an opportunity that I would have. And I figured it would be mainly within the circles I already moved in, perhaps some local media in New York because of being a well-known voice in New York City. Almost every New Yorker has heard my voice at one time or another, that would be the extent of it. But the whole voice thing seemed to have captured the imagination of the media. And it became not just a local New York story, but a national and even an international story. So I was doing articles and interviews and videos with the Associated Press, Reuters, Good Morning America, CBS News. It was amazing. I did international interviews in Japan, Brazil, Germany, the Netherlands. So it extended far beyond just the New York metropolitan area. But again, New York is a world city. The United Nations obviously is there, and many people from around the world have traveled to New York. So New York is a little bit of a different animal than most other cities.
Yeah. Now, the way you describe it, it sounds like this was mostly though like it required some work, it was mostly a positive experience. To correct me if I'm wrong. Is
No,
there
it was.
anything? Is there anything you would have done differently in retrospect? You're 2+ years removed from that transition. Would anything have helped make that smoother, or
Really, I don't think.
okay.
I am very pleased with how well my transition has gone, and I am very privileged for a variety of reasons. First of all, I'm privileged because I had an opportunity to have my career and to accomplish so much in my career. And I credit a good part of that to, being a white cisgender male, or at least seen as that. So that certainly played a role. If I had transitioned when I was in my 20s, I don't think I would have had the career that I had had. But I also think that I've been privileged to have a tremendous amount of public acceptance. And there are many trans people that do not experience that. And I can't put my finger on exactly why that is in my case, but it is something that I certainly acknowledge, and I don't downplay that I've had this privilege of having so many people support me. It's wonderful when I see my story being shared on social media, to see comments from people that I will never meet and don't know and be supportive in their comments. Of course, there are negative comments there, but overwhelmingly, they have been positive comments. And again, part of that is where I live in the New York metropolitan area, that this is a part of the country that has generally been very supportive in recent years of the trans community. So that makes a big difference. If I were in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, it may not have gone as well. So a lot of this is circumstances.
Well, I'm glad for that, and you're a delightful person, and been so generous with insights with me. I think being a likable person is also a big big part of this. You're just a really friendly person. So I can't help but think that helps. So, but
Yeah, even before I transitioned, I like to come across as a friendly person. I wanted to have that kind of a personality. I think part of that was, again, being on radio. I remember when I was just starting out, you would run across all sorts of people who were in the media who had much more experience and much better jobs than when you're starting out. And the people that I admired the most were those who treated everyone well and didn't have a diva complex, and that could be male or female, that they treated people well. And that was something I wanted to emulate, and hopefully I have.
yeah. Well, let me say that you have, because here I am with a podcast I've started this year, and just from a cold email, Bernie, you've been so nice to hop on this podcast and share all these great experiences and insights. So thank you. I appreciate
You're welcome.
it. Hopefully that's an example I can carry forward as well. Well, so just to zoom out a little bit on the topic of personal branding and the media channels we use. You've been doing this work for decades. You've focused on the transportation industry. What changes have you seen over these decades that are major, that maybe we wouldn't have thought about from being slightly outside of the loop that you're in? And what do you think are future changes that may be affected by other cultural changes or AI or current trends that you see?
Well, without a doubt, transportation, like many other industries, has been drastically affected by technology. Obviously, a big one was just the whole creation of the internet and what that has meant. Again, like I say, back in the day when I was a traffic reporter the first time round, it was the radio was how you got your traffic information. There was no Google Maps or Waze or any of those types of devices. And now people, especially if they're traveling to areas that are unfamiliar, they're using that technology to guide them, to tell them where to go. And the need for traffic information on the radio is not as great as it once was. So that would be a perfect example. AI, I'm still interested to see where that's going to take us and how that's going to be. Obviously, I guess that you could consider this under the big umbrella of AI, autonomous vehicles, and what that's going to mean. I never thought that we would have vehicles driving themselves at such an early point in the process. Not that the technology is perfect, it still has a long way to go. But to see videos of robo-taxis in cities taking people from point A to point B with no one in the front seat still is a pinch me moment that I can't believe this is happening. I had, probably 15, 20 years ago on a closed course in Florida, an example of an autonomous vehicle. And it was very simple, but it was amazing then, and it's even more amazing now. That was a closed course. There was no other traffic. There was somebody behind the wheel in case anything went wrong, but it was still amazing to see. So I think we will get, hopefully, that technology. One of my biggest hopes for technology is that it improves safety. That when you have human beings behind the wheel, which can suffer from a lot of distraction, medical issues, a variety of different things, they're going to make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can lead to crashes. I am hopeful that the technology will improve safety. I don't think it's ever going to be perfect, but in the same way that we now get on a airliner and have every expectation that it's going to deliver us to where we're going without any problems, that the same will be true when we get behind the wheel, if there even is a wheel, in our cars to go someplace, and we're not going to have to worry about those other drivers who are out on the road. And even if it's not fully autonomous, the ability for the technology to protect us to some degree. It's already there. Things like automatic braking and warning systems and those types of things. So I think those are already there. I'm very interested in transit, so I hope that transit continues to play a big role. It's interesting. We talked for years about cutting traffic, and then COVID came along, and now all of a sudden we had no traffic, but there were other effects of that. How is that affecting downtowns? We're still seeing the restaurant industry in downtowns recovering from that. So what you wish for isn't always what you want to have happen in the long run. So different things of that sort, how that's all going to play out.
Yeah. Well, great insights. I share your hopefulness. I think that the technologies around AI do present a lot of opportunity if if they're applied well, I wouldn't want it to become a intellectual drain on and keep us tied to our chairs even more. But I think that we're about to see some even bigger changes, and I think they'll be good. But
I certainly hope so. It's like anything. When the internet first came along, we all had high hopes for what it could do, and it's lived up to some of those hopes, but it's also shown a dark side in many respects. So you've got two sides of a coin, that the good and the bad that you have to deal with.
Absolutely. Well, Bernie, this was a really great conversation. I appreciate your openness and willingness to share your personal journey and insights about transit and the media channels that we can leverage. And I will include in the show notes links where people can reach you if they'd like to learn more or potentially work with you. And but I look forward to continuing our friendship in the future, and just have really appreciated getting to know you.
Oh, thank you so much, Reed. It was a pleasure to be on the podcast. I wish you all the best with it, and I'm looking forward to continuing the friendship as well.
Thank you.
Want to stay ahead of what's actually working in marketing right now? Head over to MarketSurge.io and see how we're helping businesses grow smarter, faster, and louder. That's MarketSurge.io, because your next breakthrough shouldn't be a guess.